Story 1, The Medic's Dark Duty. Winter in the Ardennes was cruel. The snow fell relentlessly, blanketing everything in a layer of white that looked peaceful from a distance but was deadly in its stillness. The ground was frozen solid, and the air was so cold it burned to breathe. The German army, stretched thin, was struggling to maintain its grip on the region. Supplies were low, and morale had been shattered long ago. The soldiers, weary and broken, trudged through the snow, their faces pale and gaunt from both exhaustion and the harsh weather. The war had taken more than just their strength. It had taken their humanity, piece by piece. In a small encampment tucked away in the desolate woods, one medic found himself staring at the disarray around him. The sounds of distant artillery echoed through the air, but here, in this temporary base, the silence was deafening. His name was Carl, and like the others, he was a shadow of the man he once was. He had been a medic for years, but no amount of training could prepare him for what was unfolding before him. The wounded came in waves, their faces twisted in pain, their bodies broken and battered. The supply lines had been cut off for weeks, and they had run out of everything: plasma, bandages, antiseptics, everything except for the raw desperation that clung to every soldier in that camp. Carl worked tirelessly, his hands trembling as he tried to patch up wounds with whatever scraps of medical supplies he had left. He had always prided himself on his resourcefulness, but now it seemed even his skills were useless. As the day wore on, the camp descended into chaos, the stench of blood mixing with the acrid smoke from distant gunfire. The soldiers who had survived the bombardment now lay in agony, their moans mixing with the screams of the dying. Yet, through it all, Carl remained calm, focused on his work, though the sounds of the suffering soldiers haunted him. The night was colder than ever. The camp was dimly lit by lanterns, casting shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly, like dark fingers reaching across the snow-covered ground. The medic moved from soldier to soldier, applying bandages, giving what little care he could. But every wound seemed more dire than the last. The men's blood stained the snow, turning the once pristine white landscape into a grotesque canvas of crimson. Then came the laugh. At first, Carl thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, the sound of men delirious from pain. But it wasn't. It was real. It was a low, sinister cackle, almost girlish in its glee. It echoed through the camp, sharp and unnerving. Carl froze, his eyes scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. It was just the men and the endless stretch of the forest. And yet, the laugh persisted, growing louder, more disturbing. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once, reverberating through the walls of the makeshift tents, seeping into the very air they breathed. The men around him seemed oblivious, lost in their own pain, but Carl could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. He continued his rounds, but with each step, the air grew colder, heavier. The laugh echoed again. And this time, Carl's stomach twisted with dread. It wasn't just the laugh that unnerved him. It was the feeling that followed it. The feeling that something was watching him. Something terrible. Hours passed and the bombardment finally ceased. The camp fell into a tense quiet, the soldiers too exhausted to speak. Carl couldn't sleep, though. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling of unease that clung to him. The laugh had stopped, but the darkness seemed deeper now, pressing in on him from all sides. His thoughts spiraled as he recalled the strange feeling from earlier, that sense that something was off, that something unnatural had taken hold of their camp. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, Carl was already up. He stumbled outside to check on the soldiers who had been treated the night before. He was moving slowly, the fatigue weighing on him, but the cold air bit at his skin, reminding him that he had no time to rest. When he entered the small tent where the men had been recovering, his eyes immediately went to the soldiers' beds. Something was wrong. The blood-stained sheets were disturbingly still. At first, Carl thought it was the shock of exhaustion playing tricks on his eyes. But no, the blood, thick, dark red, wasn't just spilled on the sheets. It was everywhere, and it wasn't just blood. Carl's heart sank as he stepped closer, his stomach churning. The bandages that he had so carefully wrapped around the men's wounds were gone, ripped off, shredded, leaving nothing but raw, gaping wounds that were now covered in something else. Flesh. He recoiled in horror. What was this? The bandages had been replaced with strips of human skin, freshly cut and grotesquely sewn into place. The soldiers who had been given blood transfusions were now covered in patches of skin, torn from someone else's body. Carl felt the blood drain from his face. He stumbled backward, his legs weak beneath him. The laughter came again, louder this time, unmistakable in its manic tone. Carl spun around, his pulse pounding in his ears, but once again there was no one. No one in the camp seemed to notice, lost in their own suffering. But Carl could hear it, feel it, the presence in the camp, something lurking, something alive in the darkness. It was as though the very air had thickened with it, the atmosphere suffocating, like an invisible force pressing down on his chest. Carl's eyes darted to the medic's station. There, in the dim light of the tent, he saw the equipment he had used. The scalpel, the vials of blood, still on the table. His breath hitched as he noticed something else. The blood wasn't just on the soldiers. It was on the scalpel, too, smeared in an unnatural pattern, as if the tool had been used for something far more horrifying than medical purposes. Carl's heart raced, his thoughts spiraling in terror. He turned quickly, his hand reaching for his rifle, but when he looked back toward the men, they were no longer lying still. Their eyes opened all at once, wide and lifeless, filled with an empty gaze that seemed to pierce through him. "No," Carl whispered, backing away slowly, his hands trembling. But before he could move further, one of the men sat up, a low, guttural sound escaping from his throat. It wasn't a groan of pain or distress. It was a noise of something else, something inhuman. The soldier's mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, blood began to drip from his lips, pooling on the ground beneath him, before the man collapsed back onto the cot, his body limp once again. Carl's mind raced. This wasn't war. This wasn't medicine. Something had gone terribly wrong. He had been a part of it. He had done this. He had treated the soldiers, patched them up, used blood to save them. But now, he realized, the blood had become part of something else. It was feeding something darker, something alive. The sound of the blood dripping was the only thing Carl could hear now. The rhythmic pattering, like a twisted metronome, marked each beat of his heart, each tremor of his hands. He backed away from the cots, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The soldier's eyes, those lifeless, cold eyes, haunted him as they stared at him with an almost accusing glare. Had they truly died, or was this something else? Something far more sinister. His stomach churned at the thought. He stumbled back to the corner of the tent, his back against the canvas wall, eyes darting around, looking for some kind of answer. But there was nothing. No rational explanation. No solace. The familiar tools of his trade, the instruments of healing that now felt tainted. He had been the one to tend to these men, the one to administer the blood transfusions, the one to wrap the gaping wounds that now pulsed with unnatural life. The unsettling giggles echoed through the camp again, louder this time, and closer. Carl clenched his fists, forcing his mind to focus, to regain some semblance of control. He had to do something. He had to fix this. He had to stop it before it spread. But how? What could he possibly do in the face of something like this? Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his head. It was as though his skull was being crushed from the inside. His vision blurred and he stumbled forward, landing hard on his knees. His breath was shallow, his chest tightening. A wave of dizziness swept over him, and he felt a dark presence settle in around him, like the air had turned thick with malice. He fought to stay conscious, but the sensation of being trapped in something dark and suffocating was overwhelming. Something was wrong, deeply wrong inside him. A guttural voice echoed in his mind, not his own, but something ancient, something malevolent. "You are one of us now." Carl's heart stopped. The voice in his head was not human. It was something darker. He looked around wildly, his chest heaving in panic, but there was no one there. The soldiers remained motionless, their eyes fixed on the ceiling, but their mouths were twisted into unnatural grins, as though they were in on some horrific secret. "The blood is ours," the voice continued. "You fed us. Now we are part of you." Carl's hands flew to his head, his fingers digging into his scalp as though trying to rip out the voice. But it was no use. It was inside him, inside his thoughts, inside his soul. The darkness had taken root, and now it was feeding on him, on his fear, on his guilt. The voice whispered again, louder this time, as though it was surrounding him, closing in on him from all directions. "There's no escape. You belong to us." Carl collapsed to the floor, his body racked with pain, sweat pouring from his brow. His heart was pounding so hard he could barely breathe. His vision swirled and the world around him began to blur, the edges of his reality fraying like the threads of an old, worn cloth. The sounds of the camp, once distant and muted, now felt as though they were reverberating within his very bones. The giggles were louder now, distorted and echoing in every direction. But it wasn't just the giggles anymore. It was voices. Whispers, laughter, pleading cries, all blending together in a cacophony of madness. And then, he saw it. From the corner of his eye, in the shadows of the tent, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long, like a wraith made of shadows. Its face was a grotesque mask of twisted features, the skin pulled tight over its bones, and its eyes, those eyes, were pools of black, devoid of any emotion or light. It didn't walk toward him, it glided, moving effortlessly through the darkness like it didn't belong in the world of the living. Carl tried to scream, but the sound was caught in his throat. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The figure was there, looming over him, its presence suffocating, its cold gaze fixed directly on him. He could feel its breath, icy and unnatural, caressing his skin. He couldn't escape. He couldn't move. The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing lightly over his arm, sending a shock of cold through his body. The moment it touched him, something inside Carl snapped. He felt his body convulse, his skin burning and freezing all at once. The darkness in his mind deepened, and he felt himself sinking into a place where there were no rules, no boundaries, no hope. It was the place of the dead, the place where the soul was lost forever. Carl's body trembled uncontrollably, his head spinning. The figure bent down, its mouth opening wide, and it whispered something in a language Carl could not understand, a language that seemed older than time itself. The air grew colder, the world around him growing darker still. "You are ours," the voice inside him echoed, clearer now. "And you will never leave." The medic tried to fight it. He tried to push it away, to hold on to whatever shred of humanity he had left, but it was useless. The darkness was already inside him. The blood he had used to save the men. It was now a part of him, a conduit for something that had been waiting for centuries to be released, something ancient and hungry. His vision began to fade, his body going numb, the weight of the darkness pressing down harder with each passing second. The last thing he saw before he blacked out was the figure's face, a twisted, grotesque smile stretched across its lips. It was not a smile of joy, but one of cold, ruthless satisfaction. The figure had won, and Carl had lost. Story 2, The Figure in the Window. It began almost a week ago. At first, I thought it was a joke, a prank, a mannequin or some sick doll left outside my window just to spook me. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized that something was wrong, horribly wrong. I still don't know how it got there. I don't know how it stays there or why it hasn't gone away. It's almost as if it's pressing itself into the glass like it's trying to get inside. And the worst part is, it knows I'm watching. It always knows. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. I've heard stories of people seeing things in windows, things that aren't there, and I didn't want to be one of those people. But as I walked past the window the first time, I saw it out of the corner of my eye. A figure. No face, no clothes, just smooth, featureless skin stretched over a human frame. Its hands pressed against the glass, the skin so taut I could almost see it stretch. It didn't move when I looked at it, but I knew it was there. I thought maybe it was just a prank, some sick joke someone played on me. I walked outside to pull it away, thinking it was just a doll or a mannequin someone had left behind. But when I got to the window, it wasn't there. The glass was clear, no figure, no nothing. I felt silly, almost foolish for getting so worked up over something that wasn't even there. But when I went back inside and looked out the same window, it was staring at me. It was staring at me with that hollow, faceless gaze. I couldn't make out any features. The skin was smooth, but there was a sickening, unnatural sheen to it. It was almost like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to do something. I walked around the house, calling out to anyone who might be hiding, thinking maybe it was some kind of prank. But there was no one there. It was just me and the thing in the window. I don't know how to explain it. I should have felt crazy. I should have laughed it off. But I couldn't. Something about it felt so real, so wrong. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was watching me. Something that wasn't just outside the window, but inside my mind, too. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel its gaze, even when I wasn't looking. That night, I sat in my living room trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was just exhausted from work. But I kept glancing at the window, half expecting it to be there. I told myself I was just paranoid, but every time I looked, I saw nothing. It wasn't until I went to bed and pulled the covers over my head that I finally felt a bit of relief. The next morning, when I woke up and opened my eyes, I saw it again. The figure. Only this time, it wasn't just in the window. It was outside, pressing against the glass as though trying to break through. Its featureless face was so close, I could see the faint outline of its mouth stretched into something that could only be described as a twisted grin. It wasn't a smile, not the kind that makes you feel warm and comforted. No, it was a grotesque grin, a mouth with no lips, just stretched skin and sharp, jagged teeth. I could feel my blood run cold. I moved back from the window quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a chair in my panic. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I watched as the figure slowly slid down the window, its body scraping against the glass, leaving behind a trail of marks in the condensation. It looked like it was slithering. Not walking, not standing. Slithering. I ran outside in a panic, thinking if I could just get close enough, maybe I could touch it. Maybe I could make it stop, but when I reached the window, it was gone. No sign of the figure, no marks on the glass. It was like nothing had happened at all. I thought maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe it was just the stress of work, or maybe I was just overtired. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. The next few days passed in a haze. I tried to go on with my life, tried to pretend nothing was wrong, but I could feel it, that oppressive, suffocating feeling. I couldn't shake the thought of the thing in the window. I couldn't stop thinking about what it wanted from me. What was it? Why was it there? It didn't help that I could hear strange noises coming from the window at night. Soft tapping sounds, almost like someone gently tapping their fingers against the glass. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house settling. I knew it was there, just outside the window, waiting for me to look. And I couldn't. I couldn't make myself look. Finally, after nearly a week of this torment, I decided I had to confront it. I had to face whatever was in that window, once and for all. I went into the kitchen that Thursday afternoon, determined to open the window. I thought maybe if I could get a closer look, maybe if I could see it up close, I could make sense of what was happening. But when I tried to open the window, it was stuck. I tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. I could feel the coldness of the glass pressing against my hands, but I knew deep down it wasn't the glass that was keeping me from opening it. It was something else, something holding it down, something keeping it closed. And then I saw it. For the first time, I saw its face up close. Its skin was stretched tight over its features, its eyes and mouth hidden beneath layers of flesh. The skin around its mouth had been pulled back, revealing a cavernous, gaping smile that seemed to grow wider with each second. Its eyes were not eyes at all, but hollow sockets, black as midnight, staring directly into me. The skin pulled back even further, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and I saw its throat, deep, dark, and empty, like the cavernous mouth of a beast. A rumble filled the house, low and menacing, vibrating the walls and the windows. The air grew colder, and I could feel the pressure building in my chest. The window began to crack, a thin line appearing across the glass, spreading like a spider's web. The rumble grew louder, and the cracks grew deeper. In a panic, I reached for the duct tape, frantically slapping it across the window to hold it together. As soon as the tape touched the glass, the rumble stopped. The cracks healed. The figure stopped smiling. It was gone. For now. It's been hours since the rumbling stopped. The silence in the house is deafening. There are no more cracks, no more whispers. But I can feel it. I can feel its presence. Its claws are still there, gripping the back of my chair. I can hear its skin stretching as it smiles. It's watching me. And now I can't escape. The silence in the house felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though everything seemed calm. The rumbling had stopped, the cracks in the window had healed, and the figure had vanished. But the oppressive tension in the air had only grown stronger. I sat there in my chair, motionless, my hands clenched tightly to the armrests, my pulse racing. I couldn't bring myself to leave. I was trapped, frozen by an invisible force that made every movement feel impossible. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly. I looked at the clock, 2:34 a.m. I had been sitting there staring at the empty window for hours. The air felt colder now, colder than it should have been, and the room seemed darker. Every corner was swallowed by shadow, and the light from the street lamp outside flickered sporadically, casting erratic flashes of illumination across the walls. I tried to focus on something, anything, to distract myself from the growing panic in my chest. But the whispers started again, soft, faint at first, but growing louder and clearer with each passing minute. They came from all around me, from the walls, from the floor, from the corners of the room. A low guttural murmur that crawled into my brain and made my thoughts spin. I wanted to scream, to shut it all out, but I couldn't. My throat was tight, the words lodged in my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. My eyes were glued to the window. The figure would return, I knew it. I could feel it in the very marrow of my bones. And then it happened again. A faint tapping sound, like a fingernail tapping against glass, echoed through the room. I turned slowly, my heart slamming against my ribs, my breath shallow and quick. The tapping came again, louder this time, and it was coming from the window. I could feel my body freeze in terror, unable to move, unable to even blink. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Something held me there, something more powerful than fear, something dark and cold that kept my gaze locked on that spot. The figure appeared again, just as it had before, only this time it was closer. It was pressing its faceless body against the glass, its pale, hairless skin stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Its head tilted to the side, and I could feel its gaze piercing through the glass, through the walls, straight into my soul. I felt its presence, as if it were inside my head, whispering my name, calling to me. Its mouth twisted into that same horrible grin, a grin that was both unnaturally wide and grotesque. The skin around its mouth stretched, revealing the sharp, jagged teeth beneath, and I could hear the faint, sickening sound of skin being pulled tighter. The figure's eyes, or rather the empty sockets where its eyes should have been, stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to move, tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I was paralyzed, locked in place by the suffocating presence of the figure on the other side of the glass. The tapping continued, louder now, growing frantic, like the thing on the other side was desperate to get in. It wants to come inside, I thought, but my mind couldn't comprehend what it meant. It wants to get in. I managed to tear my eyes away for a split second, trying to gather the strength to stand up, to escape this nightmare. But when I looked back, the figure was even closer, its face now pressed directly against the window. I could hear it breathing. Or was it just the sound of the glass vibrating from the pressure of its touch? Its breath was hot, and it fogged up the glass, leaving behind a trail of condensation that looked almost like an imprint of its face. I could barely breathe now, the air around me thick with dread. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. The words became clearer, though I couldn't quite make them out. It was as if the figure was speaking to me through the window, through the very air in the room, its voice an unholy sound that vibrated deep in my chest. I had to do something. I had to get out. But I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure that was now inside the window, its twisted features stretching beyond the glass as it slowly began to slide down, leaving a wet streak of skin behind. Suddenly, the room filled with a bone-chilling cold. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me, even though the heater was running. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on me. I reached for my phone with trembling hands, hoping to call for help, but the moment I looked down at the screen, it flickered and went dark. The phone was dead. It's not real, I thought. This can't be real. But my mind was unraveling. I knew it wasn't a hallucination. I could feel it. This was happening. This thing, this presence was real. Then, without warning, the window shattered. It wasn't the sound of glass breaking. It was as though the entire window had burst, an explosion of sound and glass that rang in my ears like the shattering of my sanity. I covered my face with my hands, too terrified to move, too terrified to look. When I slowly lowered my hands, I saw it. The figure was inside my house. Its body had slipped through the broken window, its skin still pressed against the frame, now writhing and twisting as if it was no longer bound by the laws of nature. It seemed to melt, to seep through the shards of glass, its form becoming fluid, liquid, and yet still somehow human. Its grin widened, impossibly wide, and its jagged teeth gleamed in the dim light. I could hear the sound of its skin stretching, like leather being pulled taut. The room was colder now, so cold that I could see the air crystallizing in front of me. Its grin, that horrible, twisted grin, was the last thing I saw before I felt the cold fingers wrap around my throat. The whispers were gone now. All that remained was the feeling of its breath. No longer a presence behind me, but in front of me. The thing was so close now, its touch so real, so alive. I could feel it smiling as though it had won, and I was its prize.